Most people think that getting proportions right is all about talent, but after decades of drawing and tattooing, I can tell you that that's just not true. I've watched my students' work go from stiff and awkward to confident and accurate just by changing a few habits. So I'm going to show you 5 proven habits so you can stop struggling with proportions and transform your work into accurate masterpieces. To start, I'm going to show you how to stop fixating on specific areas and get lost in the details right at the beginning. I used to focus on details straight away. I used to just hunch over my paper, my nose almost touching what I was doing, convinced that that was the secret to a masterpiece. I thought the closer I could get, the more I could concentrate and focus on the details and create this incredible masterpiece. Instead, I ended up frustrated, overworking every single section, and everything was out of place. So not only did I lose time, but I was also left with a portrait that didn't look like who it was meant to be. It was like trying to read a book, but your face is planted in the paper. You can see the text, but you're just missing the entire story. That's when I realized the secret isn't actually about getting closer. It's actually about stepping back. When you're too close, you're limiting yourself to this tiny section, which stops you from being able to see the actual structure of the portrait. But when you give yourself that distance, all of a sudden your vision goes from this to this. So every time I work on a portrait, I'm always giving myself an arm's distance because it gives me that clarity of what I'm actually doing. So now you can see the portrait clearly. You want to approach it in the easiest and most approachable way and concentrate on the most important parts of the portrait, which are the basic shapes of the tones. And you might be thinking, but how do you actually focus on those basic tonal shapes? Well, let me show you how to simplify your beginning stages so you're set up for the most accurate and realistic portrait without the headache. I used to stare at my portrait and be completely overwhelmed by the hundreds of tiny features and details and angles all staring back at me. So what I used to do would arm myself with a cup of coffee so I could focus on the battle that was in front of me, and I would just grind away, tackling everything, 10 things at once. And after hours of struggling, I'll come out the other end, beaten and bruised with my head hurting, left with this tiny section of a portrait, poorly drawn as well, and then also 6 hours of my life gone. But everything changed when I learned what it actually meant to truly simplify my beginning stages into basic large shapes. And suddenly my drawings didn't just become so much easier and lighter, they became so much more accurate as well. Now, to prove this point, let me show you this. If this, right, this is my portrait, and each utensil, each tool is a piece of detail, a bit of information the portrait is showing you. So this is, I don't know, your eye. This one's your nose. This is a wrinkle, strand of hair. You get the idea, right? If I then took all of this information of the portrait and I said, put this together, you'd be completely lost. But now let's say I simplify the portrait into basic shapes by reducing the amount of information the portrait is showing you, and I just give you these, just the essentials. So your lights, your shadows, your structure, and your shapes. If I just handed you these, it then becomes a lot more easier to put together. Now here's a stencil of a portrait, and I've mapped out every single bit of detail inside of it. It feels impossible, doesn't it? Now look at this version. This version just has the very big basic shapes. It's way easier to start, and you can actually see the structure as well. Basically, if you start off simple, the rest of your drawing process will be simple. But if you start off complicated, then the whole portrait then becomes complicated. So next time you start drawing, just block in the first 5 to 10 biggest shapes of lights and shadows. You'll be amazed at how much faster and better your portraits will become. Now, a lot of people actually struggle here because they may be able to simplify it, but they still can't get those placement of those shapes correct. Here's what used to happen to me. I'd spend hours, and I mean hours, just going round in circles, slightly moving one area and then needing to move the other. And I would just do this on repeat, and it got very boring very quickly. Now, after all of that rubbing out and redrawing, not only would I just muddy and wear out my paper, but I would also be left with a misshapen portrait. Now, there is an actual reason why this kept on happening. And when I realized what I actually needed to do, everything then just fell into place. My proportions were locked in, my beginning stages were secure, and my portraits actually looked like the person I was drawing. All I needed was an anchor point. And you might be thinking, what on earth is an anchor point? An anchor point is one specific area of a portrait that gives you the rest of your drawing a clear direction. A foundation you can always check back to. Imagine this is your portrait and you just start grabbing random pieces and try them everywhere. You see how difficult this is. You're going to be here literally forever because it doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to constantly start moving them around all the time until eventually something clicks. However, if you start with one clear, easy piece, suddenly you have a reference for where everything else goes. This one clear piece is your anchor point. And in drawing a portrait, it's exactly the same idea. You want one simple basic shape that will be your anchor point. It can be any shape within the portrait as long as it's just a simple basic shape. For example, in this portrait, this is my anchor point. I make sure that this is the one shape I get pretty spot on at the start because I'll keep going back to it to check if everything else lines up. Now, if you don't have a specific anchor point rooted at the beginning of your portrait, or if your anchor point isn't quite accurate, you'll fall into the trap of just constantly keep moving everything around, making minimal progress and just end up stuck and frustrated. Your anchor point is your North Star. It's what lets you dial in your proportions and keep everything else in place. Now, I want to be real with you. You're not going to take all of this away and just instantly start creating these amazing masterpieces after watching a 10-minute video. I'm sorry to break it to you, but there is something you can do right now to squeeze out as much experience so every drawing gives you even more experience and you can put it in your backpack knowledge. And this is something I get my students to do so they can progress even more quickly, and that's to ask yourself these 3 questions after every drawing that you do. What do you like about your drawing? What don't you like about your drawing? And what do you want to improve on next time? Now, here's why this is so important. For years, I would just crank out piece after piece, never actually stopping to think about what I was actually doing. And I kept hitting the same walls, making the same mistakes, thinking I'd just magically figure it out if I just kept going. But all that did was just leave me burnt out, left me frustrated, and made me want to chuck everything in the bin. It wasn't until I paused and I actually analyze what I was doing that things started to change. Sometimes I'd finish a drawing that I really liked, but I would have absolutely no idea how I actually got there. So not only was I repeating the same mistakes over and over again, but I also had no clue what was working when it did go right. And that's when I started to ask myself these 3 questions. And that's when my progress really actually started to take off. Now, the reason why these questions are so powerful is because if you're anything like me, I would mostly just focus on the negatives and what I didn't do right, rather than what I did do right. So by reframing how I looked at my progression, it makes the process a lot more practical and motivating. And here's the thing. I'm also giving myself clear action and what to do next time because I'm highlighting what I want to improve on. Maybe I didn't really like how I shaded the person's hair, so next time I'd like to improve on the readability of it. It doesn't need to be anything crazy. We don't want to have a list of 10 things that we want to improve on next time because then it just becomes unmanageable and also quite overwhelming. So just pick one and focus on that. It makes it so much easier, and then you can also track what is working because you aren't trying to fix everything at once. My drawing, my process, it tells me everything I need to know in order to improve. My drawing has all of that information. I just need to talk to it. I need to listen to it. I need to connect to it. So by asking yourself 3 questions after every single portrait, you will drastically improve in a shorter amount of time. Now, if you're anything like me, I was completely reliant on the grid method and I used it for 20 years. So making that transition to completely freehand was a lot. I spent countless hours frustrated, drawing portrait after portrait that just didn't look right. So if you're thinking that all of this information is great, but it's still a little bit too much to manage, there's something that you can do that takes all of that beautiful complexities of a portrait into an easier approach to begin with. Try moving from a full grid to either like a quarter or an eighth grid. This way, you're still sharpening the same skills in freehand and building that confidence, but the process just feels much more manageable. Think of it like a stepping stone and crossing a stream. Instead of making one big leap, you can use these stepping stones to get across by keeping the light framework. You can make that transition smoother and easier. So now you know how to simplify your process and use these smart shortcuts so you can create these accurate lifelike portraits without the overwhelm. But here's the thing, even with all these tricks, if your shading is just too light and it looks kind of washed out, your portrait will always feel flat. Think of it like building a house. The structure is important, but it's the finishing touches that make it come alive. Your tonal shades are what give your portrait the depth and realism. So if you want your drawings to truly pop, watch this next video to master your shading.